In this webinar, we cover court awards and taxable prizes.
Now let's talk about taxable court awards and damages. Court awards sometimes are taxable and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're taxable and you can deduct the attorney's fees, and sometimes you can't. So they're kind of all over the place. And this is an area of the law that gets litigated a lot. Okay, so you have to understand how court awards are taxed, because this is a question that you will receive from clients pretty frequently whenever they receive a settlement. Court awards for compensation for lost wages or profits are generally taxable as ordinary income, as well as punitive damages. Interest payments on any settlement award are also taxable. Compensatory damages for personal physical injury or physical sickness are not taxable income, whether they are from a settlement or an actual court award. Damages received for emotional distress due to physical injury or sickness are treated the same way as damages for physical injury or sickness, so they are not included in income. However, if the plaintiff's emotional distress is not due to a physical injury, for example, an employment lawsuit in which the taxpayer suffers emotional distress for injury to reputation, then the proceeds are taxable except for any damages received for medical care that are directly related to that emotional distress. Now, this is a very nebulous area of the code. Many times the people who receive these awards will want to argue that it's for personal physical injury or physical sickness in order for the entire award to be non-taxable, but sometimes part of the award will not be for physical injury or physical sickness, and it'll be for something else. Right? So you really have to see the court award docs. You have to see like the legal documents if it's a settlement, because sometimes it doesn't go to court and it's just the lawyers will hash it out and come to an agreement or come to a settlement. And you really have to see the settlement in order to make this determination. Okay? Emotional distress can include physical symptoms such as headaches, depression, insomnia, and stomach disorders. Example, Sheila won a court award for emotional distress caused by unlawful discrimination. The emotional distress resulted in her hospitalization for a nervous breakdown. The court awarded Sheila damages of $100,000, including $20,000 to refund the cost of her medical care for the nervous breakdown. In this case, $80,000, which is the $100,000 award minus $20,000 of medical expenses that she actually had, would be considered a taxable court award. The $20,000 of damages for her medical care would not be taxable. And sometimes you have to just do the math in order to figure out what portion of the award is taxable. And I actually have had a case like this in the past, only once, where it was emotional distress that actually resulted in like physical issues for the taxpayer. There was a woman who was working, let's just say in a restaurant, and her manager threatened her with physical injury, like threatened to kill her. The lady was crazy. The manager was a little bit nuts. And years later, she discovered that the manager was actually taken out in handcuffs for something else. So I absolutely believed my client that this was actually happening, but the manager was actually another woman. And threatened, my client and said, I'm going to kill you and I'm going to make your job a living hell and all this other stuff, but never actually like physically touched her or anything, just made these wild threats against her. And so my client ended up quitting the job, but went to a lawyer and sued the employer for emotional distress. But she had medical expenses because of these threats. She actually ended up going to like either a psychologist or a psychiatrist and got on antidepressants for a little while because the threats were really egregious, but they weren't like any kind of a physical injury, but she had physical symptoms and insomnia and headaches and all of this stuff. She couldn't sleep because of these threats that were happening at her workplace. So the amount of medical expenses that she had were offset by the damages, and then she reported the damages as taxable income on her tax return. And she actually did end up getting a notice because of this, which I successfully responded to, because I said, this was a settlement for emotional distress. It didn't go to court. It was a situation where the old lawyers just hashed it out, and my client agreed to a settlement. And then I had to deal with the tax implications of it because she received a 1099 miscellaneous for the entire amounts. Okay. And I said, look, I'm going to report it on your tax return. I'm going to offset it by this much. We're not going to report it as self-employment income because of course it was reported incorrectly. And I said, it's not. It's a settlement for emotional distress. And we're going to report it this way. And then if you get a notice, then let me know and I'll respond to the notice, which is what I did. And of course it was fine. It was kind of like a harrowing experience for my client. And then afterwards, she got the notice from the IRS, which really freaked her out. And I was glad that I had given her a warning ahead of time. I had said, you might get a notice. If you get one, don't panic. We'll just respond to it. And it was fine. It's just that it was reported incorrectly to her. And they reported it as self-employment income. This is back when 1099 miscellaneous still had the non-employee compensation box, and they reported it to her as non-employee compensation. It was not. It was a settlement for emotional distress. And, I successfully responded to the notice, and it was fine. She didn't owe self-employment tax on the amount, and we were able to offset the amount that was actually allocatable to her medical expenses that she incurred because of this horrible experience that she'd had. But just realize that sometimes you'll have a situation where you are the one that is going to have to make these determinations based on the facts. Okay. You're going to have to apply the code to the reality of the situation. If the taxpayer receives a settlement and it's for emotional distress, then that's going to be taxable in general. It's not going to be subject to self-employment tax because it's not a business. You're not in the business of suing people for settlements due to emotional distress. Okay. That's not a business activity. It's going to be taxable. But if the person actually had medical expenses that were related to this particular emotional distress, then those amounts would not be taxable. Okay. So you would have to do the math in this case. Let's talk about punitive damages. Now, punitive damages are a little bit different. Punitive damages are awarded by a court or a jury to punish a defendant, to punish a company usually. It's usually a company that's done something that they shouldn't have. And then the punitive damages are awarded by the court or by the jury. Punitive damages are always taxable to the recipient, even if the punitive damages were received as part of a court award for personal injuries or physical sickness. Punitive damages are legal damages assessed in order to punish the defendant for outrageous or malicious conduct. Punitive damages should be reported as other income on Schedule 1 of Form 1040. They're not subject to self-employment tax or anything like that. Even if it's related to a business activity, the punitive damages themselves would not be subject to like payroll tax or self-employment tax, but they are taxable for income tax purposes. Okay. And let me give you an example. Penny purchases a new car, a sporty sedan called the Flinto. Now this has no comparison to the Ford Pinto. The Ford Pinto was a vehicle in the 70s that happened to blow up and was the subject of many lawsuits that happened back in those days. And my dad never stopped talking about the the Pinto, which was an exploding car, apparently, in the 1970s that caused a lot of lawsuits to happen. Okay. But this is the Flinto. There's no comparison to the Pinto. This is just an imaginary car and no legal comparison to any other vehicle that has ever existed on the planet. Okay. So she enjoys the vehicle and drives it to and from work every single day. After about 6 months of ownership, she has a small fender bender on a residential street. During the accident, her car's gas tank mysteriously explodes. This is coincidentally what happened with the Ford Pinto. People would get into fender benders and then their car would explode because of the position of the gas tank. Once again, there's no comparison to the Pinto. Okay. Penny manages to escape the burning vehicle, but she experiences third-degree burns on her right arm and leg from the blast. Penny later discovers that the Flinto has a serious design flaw, and the manufacturer of the car knew about it, but refused to issue a recall. She decides to sue the manufacturer of the car in a civil action. The case goes to trial, and the jury awards Penny $2 million in compensatory damages for her injuries. Now, that $2 million would not be taxable because it's compensatory damages for her injuries. So she had like third-degree burns on her arm and her leg. That's pretty bad. So that money is just because of her injuries, okay? Not taxable. She also receives an additional $15 million in punitive damages, which is designed to punish the manufacturer for its conduct. The $2 million in compensatory damages would not be taxable to Penny, as it was payment for her physical injuries. The $15 million in punitive damages would be taxable as other income on Schedule 1 of her Form 1040. And generally, when you have punitive damages, this is a situation where the case went to trial, because these are damages that are awarded by a judge or by a jury because of a court action. Other court awards: civil damages, restitution, or other monetary awards that the taxpayer receives as compensation for wrongful incarceration are not taxable. So if a person is wrongfully incarcerated, they're sent to jail, but they're actually innocent, then those damages are not taxable to the recipient. And that's true even if they didn't, get injured in prison. I mean, I would assume that most of the time they are going to get injured in prison, because prison is not a very nice place to be, right? But even if they didn't have like a physical injury, then any kind of court award or restitution that they receive, if they're wrongfully incarcerated, is not taxable. Example: Ryan was wrongfully convicted of murder and was later released after spending almost 15 years in prison. Ryan was awarded $50,000 per year of wrongful imprisonment. None of the award is taxable income to Ryan. Doesn't have to be reported or taxable anywhere. Settlements for harassment. Now, this recently changed. So if you have a situation where a person gets a settlement for harassment, the settlement is taxable to the recipient. But if the settlement is subject to a non-disclosure agreement, then it's not deductible by the payor. Even if it's a business or a company, it's not deductible if it's subject to a non-disclosure agreement. Okay? Example: Santiago is a self-employed therapist who falls on Schedule C. Santiago has several employees who work in his office. At the beginning of the year, Santiago's full-time secretary, Kiara, sues him for sexual harassment. Rather than risk a public lawsuit that might damage his reputation, Santiago settles with Kiara, coming to a confidential settlement with Kiara and her attorney. So this never went to court because he didn't want to risk a public lawsuit. Okay? He just settled with her. Now, it doesn't matter if he was guilty or not, or anything like that, or if he admitted guilt, or if he didn't admit guilt. None of that matters. It's just if the settlement is for harassment and it's subject to a non-disclosure agreement where the parties can't say anything to anybody, then it's not deductible by him. He can't deduct it as a business expense or any other kind of expense. His attorney's fees, nothing. None of that is deductible. But Kiara, the person who receives the award, still has to claim it as taxable income. So the settlement was $25,000, and their settlement agreement was subject to a non-disclosure clause. Santiago incurred $5,000 of legal fees for his attorney to negotiate the settlement, plus he had to pay it. So it was like $25,000 he had to pay, plus an additional $5,000 in legal fees that he paid to his lawyer. Santiago cannot deduct the settlement or his legal fees as a business expense. However, Kiara is required to report the full amount of the settlement as taxable income on her individual return. Now, if he had gone to court, if he had allowed this to go to court, and he was able to successfully defend himself and say, no, there's no harassment, then, he's a self-employed therapist. This is a Schedule C business. And she's basically saying that this harassment occurred in the workplace. He probably would be able to deduct this as a business expense on his Schedule C because she's saying that it was workplace harassment, and he would be able to deduct the legal fees for defending himself basically in court. But he didn't want to risk that, so he just settled with her. And then since this was the choice that he made and the settlement is subject to a non-disclosure agreement, then he's not allowed to deduct it because of that. Prizes and awards. Now, prizes and awards are taxable and reported as other income on Schedule 1 of the Form 1040. If the prize or award is in the form of property rather than cash, the fair market value of the property is treated as the taxable amount. The winner may avoid taxation of the award by rejecting the prize. The taxpayer may also avoid taxation by having the payer directly transfer the prize to a charity or other nonprofit organization. Prizes and awards are similar to gambling, but it's not exactly the same. Sometimes they can be awarded and then the taxpayer will receive a Form W-2G, and sometimes they will be given a 1099 miscellaneous for a prize. Like, let's say they buy a raffle ticket and then they win like a vacation or a cruise or something like that. Then the fair market value of that item would end up being taxable to the recipient. But many times people will also like reject a prize or an award and just have it awarded directly to a charity. As long as they don't have constructive receipt, then it's not going to be taxable to them if they choose to do that. Now, example. A National Education Association chooses Paulo, a college instructor, as its Teacher of the Year. So he wins like Teacher of the Year. He's nominated or whatever. Maybe he didn't even want to win this, but somebody else nominated him, and now he's won Teacher of the Year. He is awarded $3,000, but he does not accept the prize. Paulo directs the association to give all of his winnings to a college scholarship fund instead. Since Paulo never receives a check or has control over the funds, therefore the award is not taxable to him.
The next webinar covers taxable scholarships and educational savings accounts.